Good evening, everyone. Great to be here with you. We're going to be talking about our subject, spiritual discovery, how you can better the world. And so the first thing I feel like I always need to say after this title is introduced is we're going to have this conversation with humility. Because a title like how you can better the world is kind of this big, grandiose thing. And it is big. I think we're going to be talking about big ideas. And I want to share some stories with you from my life and from the lives of some folks that I've met along the way. But it's not in the spirit of just sort of friends talking through these ideas and sharing, rather than from the standpoint of someone kind of trying to act like an expert up on the platform telling you what you need to know. So spiritual discovery, first of all, we'll talk about that phrase here along the way pretty soon and what that even means. And then we're going to talk about what that has to do with healing. And I'd like to touch on that word healing in a few different aspects. I'd like to talk about physical healing and what that has to do with spiritual discovery. And I'd like to talk about healing of character or personality challenges and kind of divisions that happen between people. And then I'd like to talk about how this broadens out beyond just our individual experiences to how we pray and help others collectively in our communities, maybe in our workplaces, or even kind of on the biggest scale in terms of the world. So before we dive in, or I guess as we dive in here, I'm going to start by telling you a story. And I'm going to do my best as we go along to define words like God and spirituality and prayer and healing, which mean a lot of different things to different people. But up front, I'm just going to tell you a story without stopping and giving any disclaimers. Tell it from beginning to end, how it happened, and then we're going to unpack it from there. So the story is of a teenage girl who gave me a call in my role as a Christian Science practitioner, which again is somebody who's available to pray and help people. So she called me up because she was having trouble with her eyesight. She had been sitting in the back of the classroom in high school with the cool kids until she had trouble seeing the board, and she'd moved up to the front. And that was going okay. She was still having some difficulties. And at this point, she was calling me because she was 16. She wanted to go get her driver's license, and she knew that she was going to have to take an eye exam when she got there. Now, she didn't explain necessarily why she hadn't gone to just get corrective lenses before that, but what she said was, before I make the next decision, it may be to go get glasses or something, it may not. I'm open to whatever, but this girl had heard something about making your decisions rooted in a prayerful kind of place, thinking out from that standpoint of a more spiritual perspective in order to do anything in life. So that's where she was coming from, and she said, can we pray together? I'm going to go in later this week to do the written part of the driver's license exam, and I'm going to have to do that eye exam then. And at some point along the way, I'll make a decision as to what to do. But I'd like to pray with you. So I said, okay. And the more we talked about it, something came out of this conversation about how we were going to pray. And I guess the one disclaimer I am going to give you is that when I talk about how we prayed, I don't want it to sound like I feel like this is how everybody should pray under similar circumstances, because I really feel that everybody has a completely individual walk, has their own things to learn, their own ways to grow spiritually. And so this is what came out of the conversation for this young woman and what it seemed like was going to be helpful to her. So in our conversation, what we talked about was actually, let's take the focus off of you completely. Let's think about how we're looking at other people. What do you see out there? Do you see people who are good and kind? And because she was already calling me from the basis of kind of prayer and the Bible, talked about, do you see them in a way that you think God sees them? Through the eyes of love? Or do you feel like you see, good folks, not good folks, people that have good personalities, people that don't? And, the answer was probably obvious, as it would be for most of us. Don't just see a lot of pure good out there. We said, let's pray about that then. In fact, anytime the focus comes back to you, let's take it off you and just remember this is going to be our deal. Take it off of you every time. And as you look out there, try to see these folks more as you think God might see them. So that was our deal. So she prayed along those lines, I prayed along those lines, and prayed in support of her. Again, we're going to talk about all that and what that means in a minute. But the gist was, after a week, she called me up. She said, I'm going in now to take that written part of the exam. I'm going to do the eye exam. And I said, okay, that's fine. Let's keep at it. Let's keep our deal. When you get there in line and you're standing there, it was just a line of people before you get to the eye chart. I said, don't start thinking about yourself. I want you to love every person in that line the best you can from whatever your sense of how God might see them would be. And she said she did that because she called me back later that day and she said, I was keeping our deal, I was on top of that, and then something happened. She said, when I got to the front of the line, I looked up and she said I could read the eye chart perfectly. So she passed the eye exam with no problem, 20/20 vision. This was actually about 8 years ago now. So she has since gone through college, is in her first career. She works in Washington, D.C. for a government organization where she's required to take eye exams periodically, and she says that those exams plus another subsequent one she took in college at one point have continued to show that she has 20/20 vision, and she had no more problem with her eyesight since that time. Okay, so here's where we're going to pause, and we're going to just talk about that for a second. What happened there? And where I want to start is with the word prayer, because I talked about how we prayed together, and we're going to tie in prayer to spiritual discovery. So we prayed together. What does that mean? There are many different ways to pray. And I think when we talk about these kind of spiritual subjects, again, I feel it's very legitimate to have different points of view about things. They're big, kind of infinite subjects. But in order to get an idea of, well, is it just kind of everybody's opinion, or can you hone in on anything that might be helpful to everybody? And so if we were going to hone in, I think we could look at Jesus as a model, because Jesus was asked, how do you pray? And so we have some great kind of guidance there. This account comes up 2 different times. It's told slightly differently, but the main points are the same in both accounts. In the Gospels, that's the books of Matthew and Mark in the New Testament of the Bible. He's asked, how do you pray? And the first thing that he says is, don't do it to impress other people. He said, go into your closet and pray. And then he gives what many Christians today call either the Our Father or the Lord's Prayer. And the gist of that prayer is it talks about the nature of God, it talks about our relationship with God, and about what that means in our lives. So if we're to kind of paint our own broad brushstroke here and look at that, Jesus is saying, step back from your concerns about what other people are thinking about you and what you're doing. Don't do what you do for them. This is about you and God. This is about a direct thing that's going on. And you could maybe also say, if you're going to that place where you're going to step back, take a step back from, while you're at it, your own opinions. Take a step back from your fear. Take a step back from your knee-jerk reaction to whatever seems to be going on in a difficult or heated moment. Take a step back from your own preconceived notions about things. Take a step back from just the surface appearance of things. And then get focused on the nature of God. So if we're to follow this pattern, let's talk about God now for a second. If Jesus is talking about how do you pray, and the first is take a step back from all that and get focused on the nature of God. Well, again, let's look at what Jesus said. What is God? At some point, Jesus says God is spirit. He says those that worship God have to worship God in spirit and in truth. So God is spirit. Now, anyone here really connect with that word, feel that spirit is just, yeah, God, spirit, got that, feel close to that? Some people do. Some people feel like the word spirit is really pretty abstract. You talk about love, and that's like, I get that, right? But spirit can feel abstract to people, so I want to try and help with that a little bit. The word spirit, the word that's translated into English as spirit, is actually in Greek in the New Testament, And the word that's used is actually the same word that's used throughout the Bible, both in Hebrew and Greek, and it's the same word that's used for wind or for breath. So take your own kind of translation out of it and just look at that root word for a second. God is spirit. God is like the wind. God is like our very breath. God is like the air all around us. Actually, what the word spirit does in that context is instead of making God feel far off and abstract and ethereal, it gives us the sense of something that's ever present. The air is everywhere you go. Your breath is everywhere you go. Your breath is what keeps you alive. In fact, the Hebrew word, one of the Hebrew words for God, Yahweh, people say it was actually spelled without vowels, and so if you try and say YWHW without a vowel, try that for a second. It's kind of hard. But some Bible scholars, Hebrew Bible scholars in particular, say that it symbolized breath. It was the sound you make when you breathe. So this idea of God being so close, so ever-present, so always with us. In fact, Jesus in that same space where he's talking about God as spirit says you can't see the wind, you don't know where it's coming or where it's going, but you see the leaves rustling in the trees. You feel it. So God is a feel. You see the effect of God, but you don't necessarily see God. So it, in a way, brings God really close. God as spirit. Well, the Bible also does say God is love. It says God is truth. It says God is our life. It says everything that was made by God, and nothing was made that God didn't make. God is creator. That God comforts like a mother. It says that God is pure good. So the reason we're talking about this for a second is if we're talking about prayer as taking a step back for a minute from the surface appearance of things, fear, reaction, opinion, and getting focused on the nature of God, this is a huge departure from the way things seem to be. A love that is all-powerful. A love that is ever-present. A love that is our life itself. A love that is as close as our very breath. A love that is something we feel. We don't see, but we know that it's real because we feel it and we see the effect of it. So this also helps us get out of an idea of God as just like a tribal leader, like a man up in the clouds somewhere who likes these people and destroys those people. What you have going on in the Bible, most of you here, I imagine, know your Bible, but if there's anyone here who doesn't, I'd like to just offer this. The Bible, first of all, was not written by just one person. It was written by men, women, young, old, rich, poor, even different ideas about God. And it was written over a long period of time. And so you get a lot of diversity, but you also get a kind of progression. You get a thread of this development of the people's idea of God, of their relationship to God. And sometimes things that we look back on without context in some of the early scriptures that sound a little barbaric to us today. If you understand where the people are coming from at that time, you can actually see it as progress. Moses, for example, gave this law, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Well, if you know where the people were coming from, you know that before that, if somebody attacked you, you could go kill their whole village. So this was major progress. If somebody attacks you, all you can do is attack them back. Now that might sound barbaric today, but it lowered the homicide rate by like 95%. So in other words, maybe it wasn't the perfect idea of God as love, as it is expressed like later as the rain that rains on everybody equally, the sun that shines on everybody equally, a God that is no respecter of persons, a God that is the God of everyone. And certain Hebrew prophets saw this and articulated that same vision too. But if you just can enjoy the lessons of what people are learning about the nature of God all throughout and see it begin to culminate in the life of Jesus, then it doesn't have to feel like there's contradictions in the Bible or some parts of the Bible that are useful and some that aren't. There's a lesson to be learned that applies all throughout. And I would actually say that one of the lessons is this idea of God as cause. Felt, we see the effect of it, and it matters. What I mean is that people in tough situations, again, these diverse folks from many different backgrounds, find themselves in the middle of war or famine, or being the outcast of society, or labeled as incurable. And in these circumstances, these folks, they find something about the nature of God. They do this kind of step back thing in the middle of really tough times. And something gets bigger to them about their sense of God. They get some new notion, some new inspiration, some feeling of closeness to a God that really is good, that really is involved and caring and offering protection or, nutriment for survival. And in these places and in these moments where people get these new views, there's an effect every time. It's not just kind of abstract theology. There's a relationship where as people get the new point of view, their experiences change for the better. A cause and effect relationship. And so we're drawing on this resource today. We're looking at the nature of God because this is what we see folks doing throughout history and throughout the Bible. When they get a new notion of God, a bigger, expanded idea of this God, it has a tangible effect in their life, like feeling the wind and seeing the effect of it in the tree. So if we have an idea of God, this developed idea of God as love itself, of life and truth itself, not mine or yours or loving some and hating others, we've got something to build on if prayer is really all about the nature of God and what the nature of God means about us, means about everybody, means about the circumstances we face. So, okay, nature of God and then us. Where do we fit into that? Well, the first thing the Bible actually says about us in relationship to God is that we're made in the very likeness of God. Some of you here have heard that before, thought about that maybe a lot. Maybe it's new to some folks, but made in the very likeness of God. Now, if God is love itself and truth and life itself, there's some implications there that you could spend some time exploring. I'm going to read you another passage, though, that brings this out a little bit later. The Hebrew prophet Isaiah wrote this, talking like in the voice of God, speaking to us. He says, "Bring my sons from far away and my daughters from the end of the earth, everyone who is called by my name, whom I created for my glory, whom I formed and made." So, sons from far away, daughters from the ends of the earth. We're back to that idea that this is about everybody, right? Formed and made by God. Well, if we're talking about a God that is pure life, pure good, that's kind of cool. But who heard the reason why? Did you catch it? The purpose of the whole thing. For God's glory. Yeah. Now you could look at that a few different ways. To glorify something means to make something known. And so one way to make God known would be to go out onto the street corner with a sandwich sign, a sandwich board, or one of those ones that twirls around if you're super talented, and shout about it, talk about it. But this says, sons, daughters, ends of the earth, formed and made by God. This isn't just talking about what we do. It's not talking about what we say. It's talking about who we are. It's talking about our very being. The essence of everything that makes us who we are is made for the glory of God. Now, how does that make sense? How does it make sense when we have a God that is life itself and love itself and truth itself and the source of all good, that we're made for the very glory of that God? Another word to the glory of something is the brightness or the brilliance of something. You ever think of yourself as the brilliance of God or the brightness of God? Anyone wake up in the morning and go, made for the glory of God? Anyone reach over in the morning, grab your phone and start looking at your news alerts, your Facebook page, and go, oh yeah, some more glory of God right there. It's all over the place. This might seem different, but let's keep exploring it for a second, and then we're gonna look to connect these dots with what we see and what we experience on a daily basis and how this helps. Made for the glory of God. Well, if God can't be seen, if you don't see love, if you don't see truth, right? But you can see the effect of it. You can see truth made manifest in acts of honesty and integrity and lives lived with integrity. You can see love made manifest, right? You can see goodness made manifest in whatever is beautiful, whatever is wise, whatever is useful, whatever is balanced and whole. So it's like we're the place where God shines through. We're the place where the good of God takes shape, takes form. God is cause and we're effect. Again, if we're made in the very likeness of God, then it makes sense that we glorify God, that our very being glorifies God. Made in the very likeness of God. So this might feel separate, again, from the little thoughts that come to us as we look in the mirror and brushing our teeth. Not necessarily feeling like, I see some good in myself. I'm funny and I'm nice most of the time, and but I have kind of a temper and I procrastinate sometimes, and it feels like a real mixed bag. But this isn't talking about a mixed bag. This is talking about pure good. Now, if God is an infinite source, the other thing this means is that we're not just cookie-cutter little people all made in the likeness of God, repeated over and over. The same properties are in our nature, but because the source is infinite, it means it can shine through each of us in a completely unique and individual way. And in fact, it has to. If we can't be separated from God, if we are the very effect of God, then God's being needs a place to shine through, needs a place to take form, needs a place for that infinite nature to be expressed. And the Bible seems to be saying that this is why we exist. Not just sort of something nice we can think about, and we exist for a lot of other reasons, but that this is the whole point. So if this feels pretty separate from the stuff we think about and hear about on the news, let's talk about why. And this is where the word discovery comes in. I think this word is really important because spirituality, prayer and that kind of thing, can often get relegated to the realm of the abstract or just stupidity. It can be relegated to the realm maybe of positive thinking. Yeah, it's nice to have those positive thoughts. You think of yourself in that positive way, that's great. On the other end of the spectrum, you've maybe heard the phrase Tolstoy wrote, religion is the opiate of the masses. The idea that it dumbs you down so much that it's actually, dangerous or that you can be controlled. Well, if we start talking about it as discovery, this is what I think helps lift us past that idea of this is just positive thinking at best. Because discovery is what has progressed humanity. Discovery is what has progressed humanity throughout human history. And discovery has very often flown in the face of the way things seem to be. Discovery usually starts first with an idea or a concept that is very unlike what others have thought and very unlike the way things seem to be working at the time. You think about the laws of aerodynamics. There was a few people around the world who were discovering those right around the same time. The Wright brothers kind of got there first. There's a Brazilian guy who was living in France who was right on the heels, Santos Dumont. But all of these folks who were working this thing out, none of them first saw a plane flying through the sky and then started thinking about the laws of aerodynamics. It was first an idea, a concept. But because that concept was rooted in actual laws, facts of being, the way things really do work and have always worked, they weren't inventing it. They weren't creating the laws themselves. They were wrestling with them, understanding them better. And the more they understood them, the more they could build something with them. There was a cause and effect relationship that was more than just positive thinking. Not one of these folks had the methodology of just going up to a tall hill and thinking positively about flying. There was a law there to be understood. And it flew in the face of the way things seemed to be, but the more they understood it, the more they could build something with it and prove something with it. A tangible cause and effect relationship. Now, discovery is what has progressed humanity on many levels, socially, politically, and so forth. We look at how folks looked at women in history for so long, and it's not like we're done with this yet, but there's been so much progress, let's say even in the last 100 years, when people were writing about women as literally underdeveloped men. So, were women really unequal, like in their being, fundamentally less developed, less capable beings? And then one day, after some folks got together and really had some positive thoughts and gave some great speeches about it and managed to get some laws passed, we all just started thinking a little more positively about those unequal people, and we started giving them some equal rights. Is that what happened? Or was it that people who knew the equality was already there and a fact of being started standing up for it, started getting more of a voice? And after a while, our laws started to reflect the fact that had always been true, despite how people had perceived it to be, despite how it had been played out and lived for generation after generation. Discovery has progressed humanity on many levels throughout human history, but what's happening in every case is people are standing for something that is already real and true, already factual, already just woven into the fabric of reality. And even when it flies in the face of how things appear to be, because it's real, because it can be acted on, and because it can be proved, there's a tangible effect that comes from it. It's very different than just positive thinking. And it's definitely different than just sticking your head in the sand and not doing anything about, some problem, right? So if we talk about spirituality in this light, if we bring these two together and we start saying, well, what was going on in these stories of these people's lives in the Bible where they're in tough spots, they get kind of a new idea about God, and then it has a dramatic, tangible effect in their lives. Was it happenstance? Was it coincidence? Was it just positive thinking? Or was something about the nature of what's always true being understood, being acted on, and being proved? Now, if we look at ourselves this way, about prayer, again, being about taking a step back from the surface appearance, the noise, the fears, the opinions, that's kind of what any good discoverer has ever had to do. But then the thing that we're discovering is us, is God, and then us in the light of God, made in the very likeness of God, made for the very glory of God. Well, if we're looking at this from the standpoint of discovery, and that narrative, those ideas seem to be pretty different than what we see popping up on our news or even in the little thoughts that are swirling through our head as we're brushing our teeth, we kind of have to say, so what? It has always been different. Every time progress has been made, every time there's been a breakthrough, it has always flown in the face of the way things appear to be. So if it seems pretty different and pretty divorced, we can kind of go, yeah, okay, no big surprise. It always has been. But if there's reality in this, that's the thing we need to test. That's what we need to build on in order to see if there's a tangible effect that comes from it. I have one more analogy for you. It's my little math analogy. If I wrote 7 plus 3 equals on my imaginary board, 7 plus 3 equals, you all know that the answer is what? 73, right? No? Okay, but bear with me. There's a certain surface level logic to that, right? It's not true, in case you're wondering. The laws of math, we know, it's 10. But if you don't know the laws of math, if all you know is a surface level logic, and somebody told you enough that you knew that a plus sign meant you put them together, you'd go, okay, 7, 3 together, 73, right? Now, this is what happens. We look out and we say, I am not made in the likeness of God, and I've got the proof. I did this thing yesterday, or I have this pain over here right now, or if I go out and the weather's like that, I might have this problem the next day. My parents did this and dealt with these issues, and therefore this. I have this kind of an education, and therefore my life is like that, or my access to certain opportunities in life are like this. I have this amount of money in the bank account, and therefore there's a certain logic to it. And we see that logic played out. We see it repeated. We see it, over and over again. And all of it runs in the face of this idea that we get everything that we are, our health, our wholeness, our character, our being, in every single way, made in the likeness of God, built into the fabric of who we are. We don't earn it. We don't work our way up to it. It's part of just our sort of spiritual DNA. That this actually defines us, and the more we know about it, the more we become conscious of it, the more we feel free to actually act on it, the more we see it playing out, the more the logic of the surface level stuff that says we're defined by this, or if this, then that. If I go out into the cold, I may, without my sweater, I may fill in the blank. That there's a certain 7 + 3 = 73 logic to it, and there's a general agreement in society about those things. But does it change the facts? We see evidence throughout human history of surface level logic over and over again. If women are never educated, never given a shot, always kept down, and you just look on the surface and you go, well, see, they're clearly not as intelligent as men. Well, there's a certain surface level logic to that, but it's not because it's rooted in something true. It's because a wrong idea was being acted on and played out. And so, yeah, you saw it, and yeah, you experienced it. I'm not going to deny you that, but it doesn't mean it's true. It doesn't mean it's rooted in anything true. To deny it as truth fundamentally is not to ignore it. It's actually to do the thing you have to do in order to overcome it. If what it says is defining, if we can take a step back from that and there's something we can actually learn that's factual about our being, about where health and wholeness and opportunity and strength and power and so on come from, built into our nature from a God that is all these things and is always ever present and is always shining through us, then we're making a discovery. And we can begin to challenge those surface level appearances no matter how logical they seem to be. We can show that it's not burying your head in the sand to say that there's no fundamental reality in those surface level equations, but it is actually a way to bring more wholeness and health and goodness into our experience. So to me, that's what healing is about. That's what the healing in the Bible is about. That's what healing, like what happened with that girl I told you about, that young woman, is about. This was not somebody who was fundamentally broken or deteriorating or had inherited a condition that was natural to her based on what her parents were, where they came from, or what they experienced. You could come up with any reasons for why she seemed to be seeing things in a distorted way at that time, but I would say that what she experienced when she began to see clearly was far more natural. It was actually a discovery of what had always been true. That healing is not about miracles. It's not about breaking a law. It's not about a God from out there somewhere that enters into this kind of world governed by all the surface level laws that are different than the nature of God. And once in a while, that tribal God hooks you up with some good, with something we call a miracle. That all of it is normal. All of it, there's no such thing as miracles in essence. That when something like that happens, it's proof on some level of what is fundamentally true for everybody about the nature of our being. It makes sense in the light of what God is. It doesn't make sense in any other context. So she was seeing something more. She was discovering something more. Whatever our little assignment had been was what it took for her to have a bigger sense of God and her own life and her own being seen and experienced in a light different than she was experiencing it previously because of what she was learning about her source. She didn't cause that. It was caused, right? We're the effect of God, not the cause. So we're not talking about healing being sort of magic juju, where somebody's thoughts change bodies. We're talking actually about our body simply responding to the discovery of what is already done, what is already caused or created. We're not the cause of anything. We're the effect. We tend to compartmentalize. Some folks that say, yes, I understand when I learn about the nature of God, that might help me be a more loving person or a more patient person. I can understand how that sheds light on my life and interactions in a way that helps. But then there's these other things that tend to have their own category in life. The things where we say that a shift in thinking can make a difference. And then these other things where we say, well, but that's not governed by thinking. That's not governed by perspectives, let alone spiritual perspectives. Those things are physical in a separate kind of a way. They have their own laws governing them, you know, or whatever. We have these little categories. But if God is spirit everywhere, the source of all that is real, all that is good, all laws, all cause, and all effect, then the good of God is expressed in every aspect of life. That everything that exists flows from this source. And that's not just something you say or kind of believe in blindly, but the more we're learning about it, the more we're discovering about it, the more we can expect there to be step-by-step tangible results in our lives. You know, Jesus showed us something about the nature of grace. And in my little short kind of summary of grace is it's the unearned love of God. Now this good that we're talking about fits right in with grace. The unearned love of God. All of this freely given. It doesn't get more free than it's already there, right? Somebody says, I have a present for you. It's up on a mountaintop. It's hidden in a cryptic, closed box, and only some people will get there. That is a very far off and distant kind of a love. If somebody says, I have a present for you, and actually it's waiting for you at home already. It's there. It's good to go. That's a kind of a love, right? It's right. It's nowness. It's tangible. It's practical. It's involved. It's a part of everything. That's grace. The good of God, already here and now, not something we're working our way up to or trying to earn. Jesus also showed us something unique about salvation. And these are huge subjects, so I'm not trying to overly reduce them. But I feel like kind of fitting in with our theme, we could say that salvation is the discovery of the fact that nothing can separate us from the love of God. It's that moment where maybe we've been on a path rooted in the wrong kind of logic, bad data about who we are and what life is, and something breaks that. Something kind of wakes us up and shifts course, and we come in line with that grace, that sort of, freely given love of God, good of God. We start thinking out from that standpoint, acting on it, and then our life takes a new form. That's a kind of way of talking about salvation. The power that was at work in Jesus' life, that divinity, that good of God, is all tied into that word Christ. You know, Christ wasn't just his last name. If he'd been the one calling, wanting a driver's license, and he'd got it, it wouldn't have said Jesus first name, Christ second name. Christ is a title that symbolized that presence and activity of God that shone through his life, his very being. He was a window or transparency for that in a way that the world has just never known. But that presence and activity of God didn't start in sort of year 1 and leave in year 33. That presence and activity of God, that Christ's nature, has always been with us, right? It's ever present because it is the nature of God in action. It's like the verb of God, the action of God, present. That Christ presence is still with us today. And Mary Baker Eddy, who's the founder of this approach to Christianity and to healing, she felt she discovered something unique about the nature of Christ, something that helped us look at Christ as more than just a thing of the past, more than just the title of Jesus, but as something we can experience, as something that is always close, that presence and activity of God. She called it the science of Christ, or Christian science, because she felt this is a way of looking at everything that Jesus taught, everything that Jesus was, everything that Jesus symbolized to the world, and saying, if there's truth in it, and there is, then it has to still be true today. If it's scientific, something that is a science isn't true for just a little period of time or for some people, right? It has to be timeless, it has to be universal, and it has to be understandable and provable. Math is a science, and none of us just goes, math doesn't apply to me. You know? We know that when we're in math class, when we learn the rules or the principle of math, we can apply it to an equation and get the same results as anybody else. And so to look at Christianity through the lens of science, Christian science, is to look at it through the lens of saying whatever was going on in the life of Jesus and those who followed him, there's a principle behind it. That principle is God, and that principle is ever present. That means we can understand it too. We can experience it too. We can apply what we learn about the nature of God to the same equations that we all face in our lives today and get the same results. And if we work at that and it doesn't happen at first, we don't just say, well, it doesn't apply to me. God doesn't like me. It's not real. Just like math, we wouldn't do that. We would go back and just learn more until we can prove it. So it's a lens by which we see and interpret and experience the life, the teachings of Christ Jesus. Mary Baker Eddy found significant healing in her life, both from chronic physical problems, acute problems of a severe accident she went through. She helped and healed many other people. She became known as a Christian healer. She began teaching and sharing this kind of way of looking at things and helping others go forward and do it. It became a movement of people who were healing. The movement didn't actually become known just because of Mary Baker Eddy. It became known because other people were doing it too. That there was never a hierarchy in it. There can't be in a science. That doesn't make any sense. There's no hierarchy of math, where math applies a little more to the people at the top and a little less than these folks. That it's total equality. That's an inherent property of something that is scientific. And that people were taking this seriously, and they were experiencing it, living and proving it by helping and healing others. Mary Baker Eddy broke through societal conditions of her time. Now, she lived mostly in the 19th century into the very beginning of the 20th century, the 1800s into the 1900s. So you think about this time, we were talking about the rights of women. This is a time when women were definitely not preachers and writing books on spirituality and out in the public lecturing. It was actually, by some standards, considered immoral for a woman to talk in public in that kind of a way. And so this is not just a self-help system. Christianity was never just a self-help system. It was never just a kind of alternative form of medicine. Make yourself feel better, right? Break through your own little limitations at home and feel good. Maybe pass it on and let some other people do that too. It was always about challenging anything that is unlike the nature of God. And so her life is an example of that happening too. Not just, like I said, in her own kind of physical restoration, but in challenging the norms of the time. I don't think she really set out to do that. If you read biographies about this woman, it wasn't her goal. Sometimes she would get letters. She corresponded with Susan B. Anthony, who studied Christian Science for a little while, and who wanted her to come on and sort of stand up as a feminist. Well, she was doing feminist things and having feminist breakthroughs, but she never labeled herself that way, and she never joined that cause. For her standpoint was, wherever you come from, however you identify yourself, it doesn't really matter. If we're learning about the nature of God, the end result is going to be the alleviation of anything that is unlike God. It just can't stand. If there's a limitation that is unfair or unjust in society, you don't necessarily have to know how it's going to come down. You don't necessarily have to be part of the campaign. You might be, but you don't have to be, that brings it down. But if you're letting that light shine through your life, you will experience the freedom that is inherently yours, and you will act on that, even in society, regardless of the opinions that are surrounding you. So she was a pretty significant individual. She wrote this book, Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures. She wrote a number of books, but this is her main work that talks about Christian Science. It's a book about the Bible and how we live and apply and experience the lessons of the Bible in our lives today. The last 100 pages of this book are all stories of people who wrote in after reading the book because of the significant transformation they experienced in their life. Many times it was cases that had been diagnosed and labeled as incurable. So anything that was a limitation, anything that was unlike God, was what this was about shifting. This is something she felt that Jesus had promised was going to happen. Jesus talked about, and this is translated different ways. Some Bibles call it a comforter, some call it a helper, some call it an advocate. But the good news is Jesus defined it, so we don't have to kind of squabble over the words. He said, it's the Spirit of truth. It will come, it'll explain all things, it will guide you into the truth, and it will help you remember what I've said to you. So this comforter or this advocate or this helper is what she felt this was all about. Jesus had promised that it would be understandable, that we would be led into a way of understanding and remembering what he had said so significantly that it wasn't just a memory that we commemorate, but a thing that we live in our daily lives. And she felt that that's what this discovery of Christian Science was about. Again, not just about personal power, but about what happens when a life is rooted in this big universal principle and acting from that standpoint, how that empowers individuals as well as communities. She started a couple magazines that are still around today. One's a weekly and a monthly. Over 100 years now, people writing in about the discoveries that they're making. Everyday people from all walks of life around the world showing that this is happening. Because this is pretty different news than what we read about in our news feed. But when you see that folks from all walks of life are doing it, it's a good sign that there's just something inspiring to understand and be affected by. Now I'm going to read you a line from this book, her book, Science and Health. Actually, I'm going to read you a short paragraph here. She wrote, "The conceptions of mortal erring thought must give way to the ideal of all that is perfect and eternal. Through many generations, human beliefs will be attaining diviner conceptions, and the immortal and perfect model of God's creation will finally be seen as the only true conception of being." Now she uses the word science, but she's talking about the science of Christ. Science reveals the possibility of achieving all good and sets mortals at work to discover what God has already done. To me, this reminds me of a passage from the Bible from Paul. He wrote in Corinthians, "Now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part, then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known." And here's from a different translation. "Now we see things imperfectly, like puzzling reflections in a mirror, but then we will see everything with perfect clarity. All that I know now is partial and incomplete, but then I will know everything completely, just as God now knows me completely." So the idea is that what we're wrestling against here are traditions, opinions, surface-level appearances that seem to have a real cause and effect logic to them. But what we're diving into, the science of this, is something that can't really be measured, because you can't measure how much somebody loves. You can't measure how meek somebody is. You can't measure truth, how truthful somebody is. We do our best to create indexes and things, but it doesn't mean it's not scientific. The states of heart, the states of mind that Jesus exemplified, talked about, things like hungering and thirsting after righteousness, meekness, purity, that as these exist, these open us up to discovering more of what God is. The big discovery here is life in and of spirit. And it runs so contrary to what we seem to see and experience. But what I love about the Bible is it doesn't leave us with any mysteries. The first thing it says is we're made in the likeness of God, and then it really explains this issue of why things seem so different from that. It gives us the story of two characters. Many of you will know this, Adam and Eve. And my sort of summary is they're given everything good, they live in a garden of good, and then they're tempted. They're tempted to eat from this thing called the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now, knowledge means it's not about a piece of fruit, right? The tree of knowledge of good and evil. So it's about thoughts, it's about perspectives or ideas. These people that have it all good, they're tempted to eat from this thing, and they do. They digest that information, that sort of bad data. It's not all good anymore. It's now a knowledge or a perspective of life that is good and evil. And those of you who know the story, what's the next thing that they experience? Do you remember? What do they feel? Shame. Yeah, shame, guilt. Then they feel kicked out of the Garden of Good. They feel like it's not their right anymore except to strive and struggle and be in pain, to be unequal. It's right after they eat this and get kicked out that it says, and woman will serve man. It wasn't in there before. But from this mixed good and evil kind of storyline, a lot of the stuff that we've seen and experienced throughout history, it all sort of plays out. Brother and brother start fighting each other. There's divisions. All those kind of terrible issues of character as well as physical suffering start to come. Now you can look at that as a story of history and what happened and why we're all such terrible people today, really. Or you can look at it as what God made is done and it never changed. And it's still here to be discovered. That grace is about that unearned love of God which is already established. And salvation is about experiencing that, proving that in our lives through Christ, through the truth of God, the action of God, making it clear to us what is already good and true. And that the fallen nature that we all experience is not part of our being, but part of our perspective, a knowledge of good and evil. It's kind of like we look out and we see good, right? We see a tree and it's a beautiful tree, but at the same time, probably not consciously unless you're kind of twisted, unconsciously there's this thought of, well, that tree could be burned down at any time. It could be cut down. It could be diseased. It had a beginning. It's going to have an ending. It's like the materialistic perspective of life is the big asterisk on what God made. You know what I'm talking about? Like in advertisements where they promise something good and there's an asterisk and then there's a bunch of fine print. Or you see the happy bouncing ball and then it says promises you a bunch of good stuff and then it says, but may cause bleeding, suffering, dying, hemorrhaging, at any time. Well, we look out and we do see good. We see good in ourselves and we see good in others. We see compassion in men, but then we seem to also see a controlling nature or a bumbling nature. We see strength in women, but then we also see objectification or weakness. We see a global outlook of the youth of today, but then we see violence and self-centeredness. And you could do the on and ons about put anything in the mix. But that's that good and evil story. It's a materialized point of view because matter is not a thing. Spirit is ever present. Spirit is the cause. Spirit is the power. Spirit is the substance of life. Matter is a concept. Matter is the asterisk on the reality of spirit. That is, it's the fine print that says spirit, life is good and all in and of God, but it had a beginning and it has an ending. But it's flawed. But it can be broken at any time. But it has inherent problems too. And that's the information that's coming to everybody on a daily basis. Right? It's like junk mail. Everybody gets junk mail, right? Anyone here not get junk mail? Tell me your secret. And it feels very personal, and it feels very much like it's about our circumstances. It's about where I've been and what I've done and what my personality is like, or what that guy's personality is like. I've got every reason to believe he's as dumb as he appears to be. And I've got all the evidence, But that junk mail comes to everyone, and it feels personal because that's how it sticks around. When you get junk mail and in the little letters, somebody paid an extra cent to write it in a font that looks like it was written by somebody's hand. Why did they pay that extra cent? Because the more it looks like it might really be a personal letter to you, the more you might actually look at it. The more personal something seems, the more we hold on to it, pay attention to it, think that it's ours. And so the packaging is personal, but the lie, the temptation is universal. It's bad data that comes to everybody, and it's impersonal and it's inherently unreal and stupid because the source of all that is real, the source of all that is wise, the source of all that is intelligent, the source of all that is scientific is God. Pure good. The cause, the creator of all things, filling all space. So something that is unlike God can't be inherently intelligent. It has to be inherently stupid. It has to be an inherent mindless broadcast that is packaged in a personal way. But to see that it's not personal is the key to being able to toss it out. It's the first step to being able to step back for a minute. It's not all there is to it, because from there we go and we got to learn and discover what is good and what is true until we can actually build on it and prove it. But to see that it's not personal, well, it causes us to go, oh, pre-sorted, right, I got it, done, in the trash. First step, right? I want to tell you a story about a guy who called me. It was a grandfather, and he called me because he was having trouble with his grandson. These two had been like peas in a pod, birds of a feather from the time he was little. He was now an older teenager. He was living at home with his mom, and grandfather was over there, and they were hanging out one day when something tough and very divisive came on the news. It was an issue that divided communities all over the place. And these two found themselves on opposite ends of the spectrum. And everything the grandfather said about it infuriated the grandson, to the point where the grandson wouldn't even talk to him anymore. And nothing the grandfather did made it any better, it just made it worse. It had now been a year. A year had come and gone, and nothing had changed. Total radio silence, and the grandfather was beside himself. He wanted it to be better. So he called me and he said, can we pray about this? And so we talked about how we might begin to pray. And I'll tell you something that, to this guy's credit, we started out by talking about, where do you think this comes from? Why might somebody feel this level of anger, this level of resentment? And as we talked and prayed about that, a light bulb went on for him, and he began to have compassion. He began to see that the level of injustice that had been done to certain group or groups of people over a period of time could make somebody feel this way. And talk about a kind of character shift. I mean, he really woke up to that. And then he got on fire about wanting to do something about it. So how do we pray about that? How can my little prayer do anything for what's going on out there in our society? So we talked about how prayer isn't really about changing people, right? And it's definitely not about your opinion taking over or imposing itself on other people. That prayer is actually about stepping back from opinions. It's about discovering what is already true. When you see people out there that feel held back, that feel oppressed in some way, you can not care or you can care, but what you really can do, if you either way, is start to discover more of who they are. What dictates their ability to be free, to have equal access to what is good, to be whole, right? It's something more than just the surface level story. So we got really talking about that, and he was really intrigued in learning more about, how do I see these people and myself and society in this whole new way? In the midst of this, we were starting to have an email exchange, and he wrote me and he said, I've had a physical healing. Now, I didn't ask him what it was, because it was like 1 or 2 lines in the email, and the rest was gushing about all this other stuff he was learning. Well, when I wrote him back later and said, can I share your story? I said, tell me what happened. He didn't even remember. So that's the most I can tell you. He said that. He said he had a physical healing, which to me starts to show a little bit how things aren't so compartmentalized. But the end of the story, the maybe bigger point here, is that he then circled back to the grandson, and he said, okay, but what do I do about my grandson? We talked again about how prayer is not about manipulation. It's not now you go in there and you say the right thing or do the right thing. How do you see him? Do you see him as somebody who doesn't get what's true, doesn't want to hear what's true? Do you see him as somebody who's so frustrated and so afraid that he can't think right? Or is his character, is his mind, is his very ability to think rationally actually already there and intact in the light of what God is and how God makes him to be? I'm not saying you say what he thinks, but that he has the ability to think himself in a way that is constructive, in a way that is free, in a way that is good. And that's between him and God. But that you're not going to buy that surface level appearance anymore of a mind or a character apart from God any more than that's what we accepted about you. Something clicked for him. And so he said, we prayed a little bit more over another day or so, and then finally he said, thank you, I think I'm good to go. Well, he wrote me back about a month later, and he said, the next time I saw my grandson, I was over at the house, and he said it was like night and day. He said it was like the light just went on, and we were fast buddies again. Now, this is about 2 years ago now, and I check in with him again too once in a while, and he said it stayed close, very close. So this is not just, life is not compartmentalized. We're not just talking about healthy bodies and bad, rotten characters, or good people and not good people. Everything can be seen through the light of God. And that's not burying our head in the sand. If it uplifts our character and consciousness and ability to think constructively, and if witnessing what's true in others can have that effect through the lens of love, then this is bigger than, again, just kind of a self-help system or a little kind of religion on the weekends. I want to say just kind of one other point I want to talk about here, but as we start to just wrap up, but talk about how does this affect our society? How does this affect the world? Does anyone here ever pray for your community, for your nation, for the world? Does anyone ever do that? A few people, probably more than are raising your hand. Does anyone ever wonder if it does any good? Oh, you're a humble group of people. Everybody raised their hand very quickly there. Well, here I'm going to share something that I'm going to share first a quick story, and then I'm going to share an idea about how we might be able to approach this with some idea that we can know with scientific certainty that our prayers do make it good. So my last story here, I was attending an event. It was a big event, a couple thousand people, a multi-day event. This was a number of years back. And it had all gone very well to the last, very last hour. It was a Q&A with the organizers, the kind of bigwigs. And one of the questions that came up was a controversial question. It wasn't controversial to me. It wasn't really on my radar. It wasn't something I was passionate about. I understand better now where it was coming from, but at the time I didn't. And but each person up front on that stage who tried to answer it, it seemed to get worse. And what happened was, anyone ever been at a ball game or something where the crowd gets up and all does the wave together? Well, this was kind of like the wave, except that's voluntary. You got to decide, I want to be part of this fun thing that's happening. This was like an involuntary wave that started to sweep through the audience of anger and frustration. And this group, it was almost like a kind of just a mass. I now understand the word mob mentality. Because this wasn't even something I cared about, but I found myself being like, yeah, why aren't they answering it the right way? Are they dodging the question? What are they hiding? And feeling this anger and frustration and realizing that everybody around me was feeling it too. This wave of just kind of passion overcoming this audience. And so the last member of this panel stood up, and I've actually talked to her now. I met her and I've talked to her a few times since then. She's a Christian Scientist, and she talked about love. I don't remember anything else she said. I just remember she talked about love, and I remember that this atmosphere, this mental atmosphere that had gotten so charged and intense, it was like someone put a pin in it, and it just started to like deflate. And all that anger and frustration just seemed to go right back out of the room. I felt like I woke up, and I hadn't been really aware of what was going on when I was caught up in it, but as soon as it ended, I was like, whoa, what just happened? How did I get so swept up in that so quickly? I would call it mass hypnotism in a way. You're just not thinking, you're not aware, but suddenly you have this view and you're acting and reacting. But this woman, she took a stance. I don't think it was even about the words. I think it was about how she was seeing people there. You look out at this room of people, and it might be a challenge. Can you imagine being the one on stage? A couple thousand people looking like they're all going to, like a huge wave, going to just topple you in anger and sweep you away? Now, you could see it that way, and there'd be really obvious evidence on the surface to think that would be legitimate. But I'm guessing that somehow this woman looked out and she saw something else. She saw a group of people, not just one person, but a whole group of people. Despite the surface level appearance, despite seeing like the enemy at the time, saw them through the lens of love, divine love, a love that defines all things, a love that is the very nature of everybody, a love that determines the consciousness and the character of all people. To look out and see that and to act on that in that moment, to me, is what has the kind of authority to shift an entire mental environment. Not because one person had some great juju, but because the principle of the universe does. And when we act on that, it's that has the authority. Love is the principle of the universe. The science of life and of being is rooted in the very nature of love. And there was a tangible effect. So here's how I would explain that. We all know 7 and 3 equals 10. We also know that 7 trillion and 3 trillion equal 10 trillion, right? Anyone here doubt that? Why not? Anyone here seen 10 trillion of anything? Could you tell me what it looks like? From an empirical standpoint, that's a toughie. And yet we still know, not in a blind faith kind of a way, but in a scientific way, that 7 and 3 trillion equal 10 trillion. Not a tiny bit more or less. Why? Because we can prove the principle of it. We can prove that 7 and 3 equals 10. So here's the deal. When we look at the world, when we look at our communities, we tend to see all these moving pieces, all these personalities, all these backstories, and it can seem so complex. But when you start to boil it down, when you take that step back and you really kind of get to the question behind the question behind the question, you realize that we're dealing with the same stuff on a macro scale that we are on a micro scale. We deal with fear, we deal with frustration, we deal with ego, we deal with greed, we deal with materialism. We deal with misunderstanding. We deal with ignorance in our lives, in our relationships, in our workplaces. And in each instance where we're proving truth, honesty, understanding, reality, love is real, is more fundamental and substantial, more provable in face of the ignorance or the doubt or the fear or whatever it is. That love overcomes fear. That truth overcomes ignorance. As we're proving that in an individual way in our lives, we're proving in essence the 7 + 3 = 10 equation. So when we go to pray about something that seems to be going on between peoples for generations, and we can boil it down and start to say, well, isn't it still fear? Isn't it still greed or ego? Isn't it still misunderstanding that would cause people just to just keep battling each other? This isn't to oversimplify things, but our prayers are they're about wisdom. They're about getting beyond the chaos to the nitty-gritty stuff that allows us to target our prayers in ways that we can prove make a difference in our lives. And so I would say with the same kind of scientific certainty, we can prove that same principle has the power to overturn those same elements on any other scale. Does that make sense? And again, this can seem divorced from the way things appear to work, but just look at some key stuff in history. Mental shifts make massive changes. Look at East and West Germany. There was not a big outward war going on there. There was a shift in thought that many people didn't even see coming. Right? I know someone who was traveling to East Germany regularly at the time when the wall was up and said, you just started to feel something different in the atmosphere. And then the one tangible thing you could see right before the wall came down were these prayer vigils by candlelight. And you may know that after the wall came down, there was this high-ranking Stasi agent who said, we were prepared for everything but candles and prayers. Now, if you were to just pray about that on a surface level, you could be praying about, a truly surface level, you could pray about how many tons of concrete are in the wall. And it's not going to get you very far. You go down a little bit of a layer, you could talk about the personalities, the ideologies, the things that led to this setup. But take it even deeper, and what do you get to? You get to those fundamental lies about the nature of humanity, our character, our being, and they're the same ones every time. And then you take it a little deeper and you hit the truth of our being. And that causes shifts in consciousness. And it was a shift in consciousness that caused things to go a different way there. You saw President de Klerk in South Africa won on the apartheid ticket. Somebody said it was like he went to bed one night believing apartheid was right and woke up one morning knowing it was wrong. Well, I talked to someone else who'd actually had dinner with him a few times as a reporter and said it was not an overnight thing, but it was a shift. Shifts in thought make a difference. You know, he started meeting secretly with Mandela and helped transition the country away from apartheid. Shifts in thought. Job creation seemed like a surface thing. The number of widgets built, imported, exported, dollars printed, what the Fed set the rate at, that can seem complex, and it is. And it's not that we ignore it, but in every instance, there's a decision behind all of those things. There's consciousness behind every action. Why does a job get created or not created? There's an impression or a perception behind it in every case. Consciousness is what's fundamental. When we're making shifts there, when we're addressing perspectives in this cause and effect kind of a way, and proving those same perspectives in our lives, not just talking about it, but proving it, we can know with scientific certainty that our prayers make a difference for our communities and for the world. I'm going to read you this line from the Bible. This is Paul, and then one more line from Science and Health, and I'm going to let you get your cookies. Paul wrote, "See, now is the acceptable time. See, now is the day of salvation." It's been said for a long time. It's here. It's now. And what is salvation? That discovering that nothing can separate us from the love of God, and are proving it. And then Mary Baker Eddy wrote this: "It is possible, yea, it is the duty and privilege of every child, man and woman, to follow in some degree the example of the Master by the demonstration of truth and life, of health and holiness." You all are needed. I just kind of want to thank you, not just for being here tonight, but thank you for being you. Thank you for being the light of the place where the light of God shines through. You matter. So I do appreciate you also spending this time and just thinking these things through together tonight. Thank you so much.